Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits, to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. And these are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without payment, give without payment. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. If the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. See, I am sending you out like sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of them, for they will hand you over to councils and flog you in their synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings because of me, as a testimony to them and the Gentiles. When they hand you over, do not worry about how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you at that time. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death, and you will be hated by all because of my name. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For truly I tell you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
I have a confession to make. Isn't it a good thing we're past the Easter season and the confession is back in the liturgy? One of the blessings of being retired is having a file of sermons accumulated over the years that for the most part, aside from your prior churches, no one has heard. That means there's something in a file to get me started on a new sermon when I do Sunday supply like today. It's not always much, and sometimes it needs updating and all of that business, but usually there's something to get me started. Not today. This particular Sunday in year A has absolutely nothing in the file. Apparently, in all the years that I've been preaching, these readings have only come up once, and that was in 2017 when we had the Dean of the Cathedral, Steve Thomason, present at St. Andrews as a guest preacher. After the first 3 years of preaching, you pretty well have at least something in every folder except this one. So in the spirit of confession, here's another one. Until 2 years ago, when it became a federal holiday, I had never heard of Juneteenth. Memory has never been my best suit, as Doug will vouch. It's a miracle I graduated from high school and college, let alone remember the details of raising our kids. So it's possible that there was something in my education about Juneteenth, but I doubt it. It's not a new commemoration. It's been celebrated by the Black community on June 19th, which is tomorrow, since 1865, as Freedom Day, after the news of emancipation finally reached Texas, and the slave owners couldn't keep it a secret any longer. When I look back at all my class pictures when growing up, you know, those where we stood on all the risers in first and second grade, that kind of thing, there was one thing in common. They're all filled with white kids. Even though we lived in the cities, I suspect the neighborhoods chosen for us were pretty segregated on purpose. I grew up in the 60s when redlining was rampant, and Black families would not have been able to get a loan to buy a home or even live in predominantly white neighborhoods. I would never consider my parents racist, but they did make choices on where we lived. In the 60s, Black neighborhoods were not viewed as safe or desirable. We lived in Dearborn, Michigan, a fully segregated suburb of Detroit, when the riots broke out in 1967. To keep us safe, my dad sent us all to stay with friends in Toledo, Ohio that summer. Only one time do I remember driving through the burned out parts of downtown Detroit, and that pretty much clinched my childhood belief that Black people were dangerous. I knew no Black people until I went to a private liberal arts school in upstate New York, and there met some fellow students who could afford that sort of education, and I could say I had a friend in PT school who was Black. Therefore, I guess I thought I couldn't be racist or prejudiced because I had a friend. But that's probably not true, as we clutch our bags a little bit more tightly when Black youth, mostly males, are nearby. Perhaps you can relate to some parts of this story, or perhaps your history is really different from mine. I wish I could say my upbringing was gloriously diverse, but it was not. As the saying goes, even at this vantage point in my life, God isn't finished with me yet. Learning about the racial history and persistent divide in this country is not easy bedtime reading. Conversations can be difficult and easier to avoid. Knowing about Juneteenth, not knowing about Juneteenth is representative of my white privilege. I didn't need to know the truth about slavery, aside from Lincoln freed the slaves, because I didn't think it touched my life. After all, if you don't know any Black people, or the systemic history of violence and oppression in this country of freedom, you don't think it affects you. And there's no doubt that denial is not an option and one of peril to our souls. Denial that we have a problem in our country and in the world with race can give police power to act first and most likely be exonerated later. Denial means that people of color live far more often by toxic dumps and rail yards and by factories and pollutants. Denial means BIPOC people, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, are more likely homeless, receive inadequate health care and education, have higher rates of suicide, violence, and addiction. And when we white folk get called on it, we can get defensive and point back to history and say, now wait a minute, me personally, didn't cause any of that to happen. Early on in my years in this diocese, there was a short-lived program for anti-racism training. And I was naive, although well-meaning. I attended a number of sessions before thinking it wasn't for me, because when I spoke words aloud like, I don't see color, I was greeted with anger and frustration by those who don't believe it's possible to ignore color, and accused of white fragility, a term which made me bristle. And I'm only now coming to grips with what that might actually mean to me. The training was abandoned in that particular form, and the diocese has formed circles of color for support in education and and fellowship for BIPOC clergy and lay people and their allies. And I don't know if I've ever written a sermon with so many I's in it. Generally speaking, no sermon should be about the preacher. And yet it's the only way I know to tell a story of blindness, my own. I consider myself pretty woke, but I cannot deny the privilege I continue to enjoy being white and never having had to counsel our sons on how to behave around the police or other authorities. They never had to worry about what they wore or keeping their hands out of their pockets or their eyes lowered when walking down a sidewalk. So I'm reading up on Juneteenth and listening to some sermons, which I also commend to you. There will be some links in the written version of the sermon, which will be posted online later this week. One of the articles came from Religion News titled, "Should White Christians Celebrate Juneteenth?" A legitimate question. What would not be helpful would be to appropriate yet another cultural activity for our own purposes, like so-called Christian seders during Holy Week. But the answer to this question was yes. Do it with your congregations. The presumption is that the racial makeup is mixed, or plan an activity with a nearby Black congregation to establish a relationship of humility and communication. The article quotes Opal Lee saying, "Juneteenth will be the bridge that we can all go over. We should celebrate from June 19th to the 4th of July. I would caution us to be careful, however. Black people are no longer counted as 3/5 of a person, but we are far from equality. And Juneteenth is not a celebration of American freedom. It is a celebration of Black emancipation. Sadly, Jim Crow laws were yet to come, and racial violence continues to this day. Humility is in order for all of us." In a reflection entitled Juneteenth and the Call to Remember, the Reverend Willis Foster Sr. and Edna Johnston note that it's important for Episcopalians to mark this holiday. They say Juneteenth reminds us that we must try to understand and talk about American slavery and its legacies. This includes talking and teaching about slavery in our history books, churches, and political discourse. It means remembering the histories of those who were enslaved here in North America and those who have continued to experience and confront racial injustice. So it's Sunday and we're in church. What does our faith in God and the love of Jesus have to say to us? The easiest place to turn is our baptismal covenant, and this is audience participation, I'm just telling you. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? We will, with God's help. Will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the rights and dignity of every human being?
We will, with God's help.
That's a good reminder of what we promise. Now the hard part is actually living it in concrete ways, beyond praying that someone else will do something. If you haven't met the Reverend Carl Robinson, canon for multicultural ministries in the diocese, take the opportunity when it presents itself or look her up online. She is a Black transgender woman and a powerhouse speaker and lover of souls. She preached a sermon 2 years ago that I commend to you, and there'll be a link posted. She titled it "The Intersection of Freedom and Healing." In it, she acknowledges that we don't like to talk about our history with slavery. There's now a movement across the country to prohibit teaching what is being called critical race theory, which denotes that systemic racism is part of American society, from education and housing to employment and health care, and recognizes that racism is more than the result of individual bias and prejudice. We don't want to go there because it's uncomfortable. And it calls us white folk to be clear-eyed, and state legislatures across the country don't like it. Carla insists that if we ever want to arrive at this intersection between freedom and healing, we must walk the road of injury and slavery. It simply cannot be dodged. But, she says, God isn't interested in us wallowing in guilt. That's a trap that deepens the divide. is not the way of Christ. There's too much justice to be pursued, grace to receive, and work to do. Hanging our heads in shame does not lead to change. Carla reminds us that we don't run from the cross. We face it, we mine it for meaning, and we know it's not the end of the story. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam knew what it was to be delivered from slavery and death. God's mighty arm and outstretched hand can do it. God is still at work freeing people, moments of large and small healing. There is a saying, if you pray for God to move a mountain, you should expect to find a shovel next to you in the morning. There it is. Think of the story of Abraham and Sarah and the improbable, impossible promise that these two old folks, older than any of us, would have a child, would be the parents of a nation whose descendants would number the stars, or that God had resurrection of the dead up the divine sleeve. With God, these things are possible. What we learn from Juneteenth is the incredible faith and resilience of enslaved people who never gave up on the possibility of freedom, who believed that God would deliver them from the sins of violence and oppression, who believed that this country was worth fighting for, who believed that their lives were worth liberating, whose tears were the shovel which would insist upon emancipation and later civil rights, whose righteous anger and activism may bring one more abuser to justice. So what about us in Sequim, Port Angeles, which our community is about as white as any? The Episcopal Church has a Juneteenth resource page that asks us to specifically advocate for 3 things in Congress: pass voting rights legislation, end gun violence, and advance the study of reparations. There are links for you to follow up on those if you wish. So we can read and listen, show up, and lobby. We can commit yet again to our baptismal covenant. Today we will end the service by singing Lift Every Voice and Sing, that was written in 1900 and dubbed the Black National Anthem by the NAACP in 1919. Here's another confession. The first time we sang this at St. Andrews, we intentionally skipped the second verse. I didn't like it. I believed it to be too grim and depressing. Sounds like white privilege, doesn't it? So today I'm going to take another step down the road toward the intersection of freedom and healing and sing all the verses. Eyes wide open, facing our history, and trusting that nothing is too hard for the Lord with our shovel.